The water of the main river ran slow and dark near Würzburg in the spring of 1945. A German teenager stood on the eastern bank, watching a coal barge labour upstream against the current, its crew working the deck with the weary automatism of men who had forgotten what peace looked like. The sky was clear, cold, the kind of crystalline blue that made you forget there was a war until the war reminded you. The boy heard the engines before he saw anything, a low drone that swelled into a roar. The distinctive thunder of radial engines pushed to their limits. Coming from the west, where the Americans owned the sky now, 2 aircraft materialized over the tree line, so low he could see the pilots' helmets. So fast, his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. They were enormous, fat-bodied, snub-nosed, ungainly things that looked like they had no business flying. The boy watched the lead aircraft's wings sparkle with muzzle flashes. 8 points of light flickering in sequence. And then the sound reached him, a tearing, ripping noise like God shredding canvas. The barge erupted. Wood splinters and coal chunks fountained into the morning air. The second aircraft followed, its own guns stitching a line of geysers across the water and through whatever remained of the vessel's superstructure. 100 meters away, the teenager stood frozen as the river itself seemed to boil with the violence of it. 6 seconds, that's all it took. The pilots never saw the boy. They were already climbing, banking hard to the south, their massive radial engines hauling 17,000 pounds of American engineering back up to altitude. The barge was already settling into the main, and the boy, who would survive the war by 3 weeks and live to tell this story to his grandchildren, would remember until his dying day the moment he understood what absolute air supremacy looked like. The Americans called it a milk bottle. The men inside it called it a promise. The official designation was P-47 Thunderbolt. The pilots called it the jug, the milk bottle, the 7-ton flying bathtub. They called it a lot of things, most of them unflattering, and they flew it anyway, because the men who climbed into that cockpit understood something that the men who designed it had known from the beginning. This was not an airplane built for glory. The North American P-51 Mustang got the magazine covers, the newsreel footage, the adoring press attention. The Mustang was sleek, fast, beautiful, everything an airplane was supposed to be. Pilots who flew Mustangs went to parties and had girls hanging on their arms. Pilots who flew Thunderbolts went home to their wives. That was the difference. And for the men who measured their lives in missions completed rather than victories claimed, that difference was everything. The story of how that difference came to be starts with a Georgian-born engineer named Alexander Kartveli and a design philosophy that would have seemed insane to anyone who believed airplanes should be elegant. Kartveli faced a problem that had no graceful solution. The US Army Air Forces wanted a fighter that could fly higher, faster, and longer than anything the Germans or Japanese could field. They wanted it to reach 40,000 feet, where the air was so thin that normal engines choked and died. And they wanted it armed with 8.50 caliber machine guns, because American doctrine held that volume of fire mattered more than precision. Kartveli looked at those requirements and did the math. The supercharger needed to push a fighter to 40,000 feet, weighed almost a ton. The engine powerful enough to haul that supercharger, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial monster, weighed another ton. The ammunition for 8 Browning M2 machine guns at 425 rounds per gun added another ton still. The fuel to give this beast the range it needed piled weight on top of weight. There was no way to make this airplane small. There was no way to make it pretty. Kartveli built it anyway. The result was the largest single-engine fighter of the war. A machine so massive that ground crews joked it was the only aircraft that could shoot down enemy planes by running into them. The P P-47D, the variant that would see the most combat in Europe, stood nearly 15 feet tall at the tip of its propeller, stretched over 36 feet from wingtip to wingtip, weighed more than 17,000 pounds, fully loaded. German pilots who encountered it for the first time couldn't believe what they were seeing. They had expected something sleek and dangerous. What they got looked like it should be hauling cargo. Barrel-shaped fuselages topped with greenhouse canopies. Wings that seemed too small for those massive bodies. Propellers so enormous they dwarfed anything in the Luftwaffe inventory. The Germans called it the dicke Sau, the fat pig. They assumed that anything that ungainly would be easy prey. Just point your Messerschmitt at it, line up your shot, and watch the American barn explode. They would learn the hard way that they were catastrophically wrong. The reason they were wrong came down to a single design decision that Alexander Kartveli had made before the first prototype ever flew. A decision that ran counter to everything conventional wisdom said about fighter aircraft. He built the P-47 to survive. Not to outrun, not to outmaneuver, not to impress, to survive. Every system in that aircraft had redundancy. The self-sealing fuel tanks could absorb multiple hits without exploding. The armour plating around the cockpit and critical engine components was thick enough to stop 20mm cannon rounds. The massive radial engine had no liquid cooling system to rupture. It was air-cooled, which meant a bullet through the engine compartment didn't automatically mean a trail of glycol and a dead stick landing in enemy territory. The hydraulic lines ran through protected channels. The control cables were routed with multiple backup paths. Everything about the P-47 was designed around the assumption that it would get hit. The question was not whether it could avoid damage. The question was whether it could absorb damage and keep flying. The first combat test came in April 1943, when P-47s of the 4th Fighter Group began flying escort missions over occupied Europe. The pilots, many of them veterans who had flown the elegant but fragile Supermarine Spitfire with the RAF before America entered the war, were initially appalled by their new mounts. The Thunderbolt climbed like a pregnant whale. It turned with all the grace of a brick. At low altitude, where dogfights actually happened, it was slower than the German Bf-109 and significantly slower than the nimble FW-190. The pilots complained, filed reports, requested transfers to Mustang squadrons, made it abundantly clear that they considered the Jug an embarrassment. Then they started coming home from missions that should have killed them. The complaints began to fade. The stories accumulated with the relentless inevitability of combat mathematics. A pilot from the 56th Fighter Group took 6 20mm cannon hits through his engine cowling and flew 200 miles back to England on an engine that should have been scrap metal. A pilot from the 78th Fighter Group had his canopy shattered by a Bf-109's cannon fire, took shrapnel in his face and shoulder, and still managed to shoot down his attacker before nursing his shattered aircraft across the channel. A pilot from the 353rd Fighter Group was bounced by 4 FW-190s over Belgium, took hits from all of them, and walked away from the crash landing with nothing worse than a sprained ankle. The Thunderbolt was acquiring a reputation that no amount of bad press could overcome. It was ugly. It was heavy. It was unglamorous. And it brought its pilots home. The most famous survival story, one that would be told and retold at every reunion for decades afterward, concerned a P-47 pilot who lost control of his aircraft over France and crashed directly through the stone wall of a Norman farmhouse. The aircraft disintegrated around him. The engine tore loose and buried itself in the earth. The fuselage came to rest in what had been the farmer's kitchen. The farmer's wife, who had been preparing breakfast when 17,000 pounds of American fighter plane came through her wall, emerged from the rubble to find the pilot still strapped in his seat, covered in plaster dust, bleeding from multiple lacerations, and very much alive. He had broken his arm, cracked several ribs, lost 2 teeth, He walked to the road, where he was picked up by advancing American ground forces 3 hours later. The farmhouse was a complete loss. The pilot flew combat missions again within 3 months. What made these survival stories possible was not luck. It was engineering. That R2800 radial engine at the heart of the P-47 was itself a masterpiece of redundant design. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, each cylinder essentially independent, so that damage to 1 or 2 or even half a dozen cylinders still left the engine producing enough power to fly. Pilots reported taking hits that blew individual cylinder heads completely off the engine, oil and smoke streaming behind them, and still maintaining enough altitude to reach friendly territory. The massive propeller, over 12 feet in diameter, provided the bite necessary to keep that wounded engine dragging the aircraft forward, even when power was reduced to a fraction of normal. The Thunderbolt did not glide gracefully. It flew like a wounded bull, stubborn and unstoppable, refusing to die, even when everything about its conditions suggested it should. The firepower helped too, though it was never the point of the aircraft's design. 8.5 0-caliber Browning She-2 machine guns mounted in the wings, with 425 rounds per gun. That's what the Germans flew into when they attacked a Thunderbolt formation. That's what waited for them when they thought they had an easy kill lined up on a fat pig. A concentrated stream of half-inch projectiles that could soar through aircraft structures, shred engine blocks, and turn human bodies into unrecognizable wreckage. When a P-47 pilot pressed his trigger, all 8 guns fired simultaneously. German pilots learned quickly that getting caught in a Thunderbolt's gun sight was not survivable. The firepower was simply too overwhelming to evade if the American pilot had achieved tracking position. The emotional calculus of survival shaped how pilots thought about their aircraft in ways that transcended rational analysis. A Mustang pilot could look at his machine and see something beautiful, something that made him proud to be seen with it, something that announced his status as an elite warrior. A Thunderbolt pilot looked at his machine and saw a promise. Crude, inelegant, undeniable. The jug would not make you look good. The jug would not get you on magazine covers. The jug would not impress the girls at the officers' club. But the jug would bring you back to the airfield when everything else had failed, when your wingman was going down in flames, when by every calculation you should have died over some god-forsaken patch of German forest. The Mustang got the girls. The jug got you back to your wife. The war ended. The pilots who survived it scattered back to civilian life, carrying memories they would spend decades trying to articulate. Some told their stories easily. Others locked them away and said nothing for years. But the Thunderbolt pilots carried something different. Not the glory of kills scored or medals earned, but the quiet knowledge that they had beaten the odds because their aircraft had been built to cheat death. The irony of the Thunderbolt's legacy came in the decades after the war, when the memory of the P-47 faded while the legend of the P-51 Mustang grew. The Mustang became the symbol of American air power in World War II, the plane that broke the Luftwaffe, the plane that escorted bombers to Berlin and back, the plane that won the air war. The Thunderbolt became a footnote, remembered mainly by enthusiasts and the shrinking cohort of veterans who had actually flown it. Air shows featured Mustangs. Movies featured Mustangs. Scale model companies produced Mustangs in every conceivable variant. The Jug gathered dust in aviation museums, overshadowed by its more glamorous stablemate. Its contribution to victory measured in statistics that nobody bothered to read. But the veterans knew the truth, and they kept telling it to anyone who would listen. At reunions that grew smaller each year, old men with hearing aids and oxygen tanks would corner young historians and explain, with the patient intensity of people who needed to be understood, that the Mustang may have won the battles, but the Thunderbolt saved the men. They showed photographs of aircraft that looked like flying Swiss cheese, with holes big enough to put your fist through, and pointed to the insignia that proved it was their bird, the one they walked away from. They talked about friends who went down in Mustangs when a single cannon round breached the cooling system, and friends who came home in Thunderbolts when a dozen cannon rounds failed to find anything vital to hit. The Mustang, they said, was a racehorse. The Thunderbolt was a mule, and when you're 100 miles from home, with half your controls shot away and smoke in your cockpit, you want a mule. What remained was less tangible, but more enduring. A philosophy of design that prioritized survival over performance, substance over style, bringing your people home over winning acclaim. The sons and daughters and grandchildren of Thunderbolt pilots carry something their ancestors gave them. Not medals or glory or dramatic stories of kills scored, but the simple fact of their existence. They are alive because an ugly airplane refused to die, because an engineer named Alexander Kartveli built survival into every redundant system, because America, in its industrial, might decided that pilots were worth more than planes. My father flew jugs, they write. He came home, that's all they need to say. That's the whole story, compressed into 5 words that carry more weight than any medal citation. And 60 years later, at kitchen tables across America, old women still smile when someone mentions the Thunderbolt, because they remember the day in 1945 when a telegram didn't arrive, when the knock on the door was their husband instead of a casualty officer, when the ugly plane brought their whole world home,